Mr. Grogan writes so clearly that he almost convinces us the whole story could be true. The New Yorker. Emmett Grogan was an unreliable but very entertaining narrator. And indeed, he was such a mystery that he would appear on an American game show where contestants were asked to find the real Emmett Grogan from a lineup of 3.
Now let's meet a gentleman from the very heyday of hippiedom.
Number 1, what is your name, please?
My name is Emmett Grogan.
Number 2.
My name is Emmett Grogan.
Number 3.
My name is Emmett Grogan.
And now let's listen.
His autobiography, Ringolevio, in some ways leaves the reader with more questions than answers. And it's a good autobiography that makes you ponder how much of that happened. His name in this country is almost totally unknown. And indeed, it returns only a handful of passing mentions in the Irish newspaper archives, and they tend to be pretty recent. But Emmett Grogan was a central figure in the great American countercultural moment of the 1960s. Bob Dylan's album Street Legal is dedicated to the memory of Emmett Grogan, and it was an unusual and kind of uncharacteristic act. Dylan rarely dedicated work in such a way. Of meeting Dylan, Emmett Grogan remembered Bob Dylan is exactly as I had not imagined him. And Grogan would appear on stage with the band.
What it all boils down to is pulse and breath. Song is the breath, music is the pulse. Poets the naked wizards, power animals of human pulse. The mysteries of breath, speech of mind. A handful of those, 7 to be exact, will bend the spine, the pulse of breath, the line of vision. As old as the race, the vision seated in the Greenwich Village, in the North Beach, in the incomplete fullness of the Haight-Ashbury, finally blossomed in the minds of some American eyes.
Emmett Grogan was perhaps the guiding light of the San Francisco 1960s moment and the Diggers, a radical community action group. The brilliant Diggers Archive website does a fantastic job of explaining the Diggers. The San Francisco Diggers, they tell us, evolved out of 2 radical traditions that thrived in the San Francisco Bay Area in the mid-1960s. The bohemian, underground, art theatre scene and the New Left civil rights peace movement. The Diggers combined street theatre, anarcho-direct action and art happenings in their social agenda of creating a free city. From the pages of the Digger papers came lasting slogans of that time. Today is the first day of the rest of your life, for one. And their free parties would bring bands like Jefferson Aeroplane and the Grateful Dead to the people. There was great street theatre, the death of money, the parade of a coffin through the streets that grabbed attention. But it was later the death of hippie parade. On that occasion, a coffin carrying the words hippie, son of media, was paraded. The message was simple. The hippie was a media invention. Dismissively, the Irish Independent told their readers in late 1967 that the hippies of the United States are sounding their last hurrahs in the squalid, offbeat areas where they've been living out their communal, psychedelic experience for the last 2 or 3 years. A wave of disenchantment is setting in. The first few are getting their hair cut and trickling home to the middle-class communities whence they came. But Emmett Grogan, one contemporary journalist wrote, was the kingpin of the Diggers. But of more interest to us on this podcast, he was an Irish American, and as Irish Americans often do, he made the pilgrimage home, or at least we think he did. And in his autobiography, he details an extended visit to the Dublin of the 1960s that is so packed full of correct detail, from the names of bar staff to the chippers of the city, that there's definitely truth there. At other times, it all seems quite far-fetched, and dates, as we'll hear, don't match up. I think the Irish episodes of Ringolevio are fascinating. This book takes the reader across many cities, London, Paris, Rome, before the Summer of Love took San Francisco. But today we're exploring Emmett Grogan's tales of Dublin. My friends, a happy new year to all of you. This is the beginning of season 4 of the podcast. Whenever I sit down and jot down a list of guests and subjects, it's always a new series, with a big run of 5 or 6 episodes from November 30th to the end of 2025. So after a good recharge, we go again. Dublin and the movement against apartheid, 19th century street trading, An Irishman's Diary, murder in the 1920s. It's all ahead of us. And a big thank you, as always, to supporters of the podcast. Very few independent podcasts in the landscape anymore. Very few podcasts without ads either. Both of those things are only possible because of the listenership. So thank you all so much for tuning in. Enjoy the story of Emmett Grogan. The first time I read Emmett Grogan's book, I found a second-hand copy in Oxfam Books on Parliament Street. Where else? The battered copy didn't have a dust jacket, which was a real pity, because the flap of the book says a lot. He's a freckle-faced Irish-American from Brooklyn who got hooked on junk while in grammar school and stole, robbed and did even more to support and protect his habit. He's the founder and chief inspiration behind the legendary Diggers of San Francisco, who, dedicated to creating a genuine alternative lifestyle, spent years acquiring and passing out free food, free clothes, free theatre, and more to hundreds of poor people. He's America's most famous invisible man, it tells us, who, determined on keeping his identity anonymous, has fed deceptions to the press and let others use his name to the point where some people think he doesn't even exist. Whenever a digger identifies himself as Emmett Grogan, the San Francisco Chronicle reported, it means nothing, since all diggers call themselves Emmett Grogan. The book was a bestseller in its day in America and was described as the best and only authentic book written on the 60s underground. And before diving into it all today, the author's note at the top of the book tells us this book is true. Names, places, and some dates in parts 1 and 2 have been changed to protect the innocent. A good place to begin before we get into Emmett Grogan and Dublin is to explain the title of his book. This he does well. It's a game played on the streets of New York for as long as anyone can remember. And it's called Ringolevio, and the rules are simple. There are 2 sides, each with the same number of players. There are no time limits, no intermissions, no substitutes, and no weapons allowed. There are 2 jails. There is 1 objective. Each side tries to capture in jail all the members of the other side while maintaining the freedom of its own teammates. When everyone on one side is captured, the other team wins. Everyone who grew up in the boroughs of New York City and played in the streets knows about this game, which is called Ringolevio. Throughout the book, Emmett Grogan is Kenny Wisdom, a good alias. But even the name Emmett Grogan itself was an alias of sorts. Born Eugene Leo Grogan in 1942, the name Emmett, he noted, was one chosen because he wanted to reflect his Irishness and rebellious ancestry. He hit on the name of Robert Emmett, but felt it was too corny. However, he liked the sound of Emmett. He added another T to Emmett, and he had it, Emmett Grogan. The book is a beautiful description of a New York City which has rapidly faded with time. At the turn of the century, he writes, this area of New York became Little Italy because many Italians settled in there. It was also known at the time as Hoodlum's Den because most of the residents were employed in the activity of crime. But what concerns us is Grogan's time in Europe, and more specifically here in Dublin. It's not completely uncommon, of course, for a young Irish American to travel here or to travel more broadly across Europe. But as we touched on in the introduction, Grogan's background wasn't entirely normal. A youthful life spent in crime or getting hooked on heroin. But just as he writes brilliantly about New York City, he writes so well about the various cities he travelled across Europe. Take Rotterdam. Looking out the windows of the taxi, he expected to see everyone wearing wooden shoes and full colourful skirts with white bonnets on their heads. They weren't, and he felt strange. He was a foreigner, and he didn't like it. Couldn't even speak with the cab driver. The way he spoke to cab drivers in New York. The guy only knew a few words in English like where to, please, thank you, and some numbers. He gave the driver $1 when they arrived, and he wouldn't accept any change. There was Paris, where he could see the Eiffel Tower stretching above the city in front of him. The bookstalls and the out-front activity of the merchants. selling their wares in the streets were just like he'd seen in the movies. There was Italy, where something profound occurred. There was a book lying on the floor beside him, which he hadn't read but intended to. A portrait of the artist as a young man by James Joyce. He picked it up and absent-mindedly flicked the pages until something caught his eye in the front part of the book. "What is your name?" Stephen had answered, "Stephen Dedalus." Then Nasty Roach had said, "What kind of name is that?" And when Stephen had not been able to answer, Nasty Roach had asked, "What is your father?" And Kenny Wisdom said, "Irish." "An Irishman." "I'm Irish. What the fuck am I doing in Italy anyway?" That moment of revelation reminded me of something else, and a man who had a very different time in San Francisco in the 1960s from Emmett Grogan, but who emerges in his book later on. Huey P. Newton of the Black Panthers recalled in his own memoir that I identified very strongly with Stephen Dedalus because he went through a similar experience. He felt great guilt when he first questioned Catholicism, believing that he would be consumed by the fires of hell for his doubt. In a way, that is what happened to me. Portrait of the artist as a young man lit a fire in Huey Newton and changed the course of Emmett Grogan's life. Grogan's arrival in Dublin is described in great detail. Indeed, there's far greater detail of Dublin than any of the previously mentioned cities. He finds lodgings and he makes for Neary's pub. It was early evening when he woke up. His chill was gone, only his stomach wasn't doing too well. He thought that some soup might help. He dressed warmly and walked down Harcourt Street, past St. Stephen's Green to Grafton and went into Neary's pub on the corner of Chatham Street. It was packed, crowded with neatly dressed, middle-class people talking about the theatre, and it was stuffy and hot. The lights were globes with brass fixings, the walls were mahogany and mirror, and the bar was made of pink marble. Pink marble. Kenny didn't really want to stay there because it was too stuffy. He was sweating. He didn't like the self-righteous looks on the faces of the two chubby men or the sound of their hollow laughter. But he really needed something in his belly, so he squeezed in beside them and told the waiter to get him a bowl of something. When asked what he wanted to drink, he pointed to a mug of black beer on the chubby guy's table. They were talking very loudly now about radio. Kenny peeled off his coat and scarf, and for want of any other place to put them, he dropped them on the floor beneath the table. This caused a few of the patrons who noticed to adopt an attitude towards Kenny who couldn't have cared less. The soup came with a "Here's your pint of stout, sir." Kenny thanked the waiter, remembering that, yeah, that's what it's called. Stout. From Neary's, he made for another institution, McDade's, of Harry Street. And enough of the detail in how he describes McDade's pub is convincing too. He mentions the barman, Paddy. There was at the time a Paddy, the legendary barman of Paddy O'Brien. He went, the book tells us, from Chatham Lane to Harry Street, where he saw a sign for another pub, McDade's. He felt better now that his stomach had done what it had to do. He'd been sick, by the way, having left Neary's. And he went in to see if he could get a sandwich and acquire a taste for Guinness's stout, which the fat-bellied Irishmen of New York City called the wine of Ireland. But they only sipped at it between glasses of whiskey from Scotland on St. Patrick's Day. He liked the saloon, with its high ceiling, scattered tables and solid wooden bar. It was a big, funky room, and the only decor was the people in it. They were hearty, and whether they were laughing or arguing, discussing or pontificating, they were enjoying themselves and each other. They weren't dressed up to impress anybody. The noise they were making was a racket of music, and within seconds, Kenny had picked up on the accented sounds or the flavoured phrases of language. When the barman asked what he would have, Kenny replied, "Give us a pint of stout and one of them ham sandwiches." And the barman did. "Thanks." Standing alongside Kenny at the corner of the bar was a not too tall, chunky, dark-haired man in his 20s, wearing a dull grey suit jacket over a black sweatshirt and baggy brown pants, and a pair of black work boots laced with yellow twine. He was a manual labourer, and those were the clothes that he worked in, did his weekend drinking in, lived in and went to sleep in, when he was too drunk to take them off. They were his clothes. He told Kenny that his name was Eamon, and he asked if he was an American. Kenny said yes, and introduced himself. They shook hands like they really meant it, and that they were glad to meet each other. Now, in his description of McDade's, not only does he describe a barman called Paddy, there's quite an interesting moment where Kenny asks him, quote, about the big guy with the cap and eyeglasses who was presiding over a group in the back corner of the room, delivering verse after verse of resounding poetry. Eamon said that was Paddy Kavanagh. who had taken over the poet's residency chair at MacDade's after the untimely death of Brendan Behan himself. Behan is a figure that Grogan mentions in the book at the very beginning of talking about his time in Dublin, that he wanted to find, as he says, the Dublin of the ginger man and the Dublin of Behan, a reminder just what an impact Behan had made culturally in the United States in the 1950s. The figure that Grogan meets in MacDade's, Eamon, convinces him to find cheaper rooms at an inn, in this case, the Brazen Head. And again, the detail of the place that is described has some truth in it. He alludes to Miss Cooney, proprietor of the Brazen Head, and the woman who appeared on the front of my most recent book, The Dublin Pub. In the company of his new friend Eamon, he describes wandering to Westmoreland Street, where we went into a cafe, bought some fish and chips and ate them on the bus, which they rode up the quays along the River Liffey to a stop in front of the forecourts, where they got off and walked across the river on Bridge Street till they came to Lower Bridge Street in number 20, the Brazen Head. They stepped into the stone-paved courtyard, and Kenny thought he was really drunk because the windows and the whole frame of the building itself seemed cockeyed. He wasn't. It was. The Brazen Head, he wrote, is a small, antiquated residential inn built in the early 17th century. The pub is a thick-beamed, low-ceilinged room, dimly lit by funky, brass-branded lanterns, and its lead-gridded windows face into the courtyard. Eamon took Kenny inside to the bar and introduced him to Mr. and Miss Cooney, the owners of the place, and told them that Kenny was looking to rent a room. Mr. Cooney just grumped and ignored the statement about renting a room. Miss Cooney said, "Oh, have you had any luck?" It's difficult perhaps for us to picture it now, but the Brazen Head was then a very different place. Rather than a pub that primarily attracts tourists, though the occasional tourist did come to see it, it was a somewhat rough and ready establishment in the 1950s. And before the ballad boom, it was one of the few places in the city where singers could regularly be heard. The great Margaret Barry was a regular and frequent resident in the pub. In his memoir, the writer Benedict Kiley remembered Margaret Barry. She lodged there with the Sligo musician Michael Gorman in the capital. And of course, the Brazen Head has a long history and at one point was quite synonymous with the 1798 rebellion and the subsequent Emmett Rebellion of 1803. In fact, if you walk into it today, I think only the upstairs of the Lord Edward has more posters and ephemera concerning the likes of Wolfe Tone, Napper Tandy, Edward Fitzgerald. And the way Emmett Grogan writes about the Brazen Head is a pub that was still in many ways quite republican. The men, he tells us, who lived and drank at the Brazen Head were members of a section of the 1923 IRA who'd not accepted the ceasefire order, had refused to lay down their arms. Besides all the talking and drinking and singing, these old-timers gave Kenny copies of periodicals which explained convincingly what they'd killed people for. One pamphlet written by a Sinn Féiner read, "Nationality is our great object, a nationality which may embrace Protestant, Catholic and dissenter." Those men, he wrote, back in the first quarter of the 20th century and the century before, fought not only for their freedom from the British, but also for their freedom from exploitation at home. They fought for the freedom to be equal men in their own country. They were shortchanged by De Valera and his pack of cronies, those Sinn Féiners and old IRA boys, and condemned to bitterness, a meagre pension, and a glass of booze or two at places like the Brazen Head. There are aspects of Grogan's story about the Brazen Head that are really, really believable. The details he describes physically about the pub and its lodging rooms, the fact that he mentions Miss Cooney, and in the New York Public Library within the Emmett Grogan papers, 1965 to 1968, there are some materials that seem to come from the Brazen Head. There's what's described as an autograph manuscript, October 11th, 1965, and also Dear Brown, I Caught Myself in the Brazen Head, a typescript poem, also dated 1965 from the pub. So it's pretty certain to me that he was there, even if the timeline in the book is a little bit off. There are other aspects of his story about his time there that are far less believable. For example, his claim to have found work nearby in the Guinness brewery. Dublin was a city of very, very precarious labour, of course. People would take whatever work they could get where they could get it, but that really wasn't the case in Guinness. Guinness was anything but precarious. A job in Guinness was a job for life, and it tended to be an intergenerational employer. But in Ringolevio, he tells us, each weekday morning at 6 a.m, Kenny and Eamon would shape up with a load of mostly older men outside the St. James's Gate of the largest brewery in Europe, with 4,000 steady employees known as Guinness men, and wait to be picked by the hiring boss to work as casual labourers until 5 p.m. Even when the workload was light, Kenny and Eamon were always picked because they were young and strong. Kenny's first job at the plant was to stand atop a pyramid of empty aluminium kegs, which had a base 15 barrels wide and was 15 deep at 15 layers high. About 1,250 barrels all told, and tossed them down, carefully aiming each one to bounce on thick woven cord pillows rather than on the cement. He became so adept at hitting the pillows in such a way as to make the kegs slide off them and softly roll along the concrete floor, and he did it so quickly without ever missing, that after a while the foreman permitted him to go home with a full day's wage, where he dismantled 7 or 8 of these pyramids in 3 or 4 hours rather than a normal 9. The rest of the casual labourer gang stacked the loose kegs onto the carts, which carried them inside the plant where Eamon worked, filling them with porter and sealing them with a bung. Now that is, of course, a bold claim to fame, that one was the best casual worker in the Guinness brewery. I'm not sure what to make of that. There are other interesting tales told in the book that just don't add up. For example, he talks about one man, McShane, again names have been changed to protect the guilty, who he met through his casual work in the brewery, but who was a Republican, and who was impressed by his knowledge of politics and his sympathies with Irish republicanism. Grogan writes, they went to a boot in the smallish back section of a pub on a lane off the quays. Over double glasses of Jameson, Kenny was told by McShane and the others they'd been watching him, and had heard him talking in places like McDade's and the Brazen Head. They were surprised but glad that an American Irishman had the will to understand properly the situation of the Republic and express a righteous attitude about its partition. They asked him how deep his concern was, and when he told them of his outrage over the misrepresentation of the Irish people by De Valera and his mob, they invited him to be a man of action as well as letters, to go north with them that weekend, and he accepted and he went. They blew the wall out of a tiny post on the border of Armagh, near a place called Fork Hill, late that Saturday night, and they were back in Dublin when the pubs opened for the Sunday afternoon session. But once more, this is where timelines become pretty confusing. So we've had the death of Brendan Behan, which was 1964. We have the real-life letters, which are 1965. Now we have him involved in the IRA border campaign, which ran from 1956 to 1962. There's also a pretty vivid description of the night Nelson's Pillar was blown up, with Grogan claiming to have been there.
The 134-foot-high Nelson's Pillar was blasted by explosives believed to have been planted by members of an extremist group.
Not many historians can say this, but I asked the man who blew up Nelson's Pillar, Liam Sutcliffe, if Emmett Grogan was there. He laughed and said, no. Before Grogan's memoir leaves Dublin, sex is involved, perhaps explaining why the well-written book was so unknown in Ireland. It was widely banned across the continent of Europe and in other places and censored, and presumably the same thing happened to it here. He describes a sexual encounter with an actress he meets in McDade's pub, and she brings him back to her room in the Shelburne Hotel, where, in his own words, they made love to each other until both their bodies were raw, neither of them caring whether the other one was telling the truth or not. That almost brings the Dublin episode of this memoir of sorts to an end. The next morning, Kenny awoke with a hangover so bad his eyes hurt as he returned to the Brazen Head to collect his belongings. The place was empty, everyone downtown watching the St. Patrick's Day parade. So he wrote a short goodbye and thank you note to the Coonies and enclosed £10 in an envelope, which he set on the table in the kitchen. He left his bag full of books outside Eamon's door and carried his bag of clothing back with him to the Shelburne, where he told the desk clerk to mind it for him. Then he went upstairs and woke Peggy, who wasn't feeling too chipper herself. They had a pot of hot coffee for breakfast. After she showered and dressed and was recognisable, they went to the lobby. She checked out and paid her bill, and Kenny retrieved his bag. They walked to St. Stephen's Green, down Merrion Road to O'Donoghue's pub, which was supposed to be closed for the holiday but wasn't. A couple of pints of stout to get themselves back together. He telephoned Aer Lingus for 2 reservations in the mid-afternoon flight to London. But I think without a shadow of a doubt, what has primarily interested readers of Ringolevio is his account of 67 and all that followed in San Francisco. The Diggers, of course, took their name from the 17th century English radicals who sought to create an egalitarian society, the abolition of private property, a society of common ownership. I mean, there was massive media interest in the Diggers in San Francisco at that moment in time.
A renovated garage, but it's really more than that. It's a sort of modern-day beatnik or hippie Salvation Army for members of this bohemian atmosphere. Each day at 4 o'clock, free food is dispensed for those who want it. Thus, it allows residents in this area to sort of keep heart and soul together.
In the words of Vanity Fair magazine, Emmett Grogan and his people created the poverty is sexy ideology for young panhandlers. Freedom means everything free was as good a rallying cry as any in young ears. Abbie Hoffman, who Grogan regarded, I think, as something of a phony and takes a major kicking in the book later on, but who did emerge as one of the defining figures of that time, remembered that Emmett Grogan was the hippie warrior par excellence. He was also a junkie, a maniac, a gifted actor, and a rebel hero. Better to look to Peter Coyote, a fellow digger, who noted in a brilliant introduction to a later edition of the book, "There is no way that I can tell you who Emmett was, neither will this book. It's like him, part fact, part fiction. A lot of anger and humour, a lot of clear-eyed calls and some poppycock. Emmett told you what he thought. He was stand-up. He was a man extreme and contradictory, quarrelsome and kind, charismatic and self-destructive, who willed himself to be a hero." Grogan died in April 1978. His body discovered on a New York subway train. And one contemporary said that when Emmett Grogan died of a heroin overdose, the dreams of the 1960s were starting to fade. Just as the Diggers would like it to be, Ringolevio is online free in its entirety. I'll put that link in the show description. Although I do think it's a book worth owning. It was republished in recent times by the New York Review of Books Classics, who rightly noted that it's as enigmatic a portrait of a man and his times as Hunter S. Thompson's stories of fear and loathing. I was really surprised happily to find a trail for the book itself online. While it may be almost totally unknown in Ireland, it does seem that some Americans fascinated by Grogan have attempted to walk in his footsteps in Dublin, visiting the places that are in the book, enjoying Neary's and MacDaid's and finding the Brazen Head to be changed and changed utterly. Grogan is one of those tangents that sadly didn't make it into the Dublin pub book, and I see there's a new book on Neary's and I wonder if he appears there. I just think with the curious mix of fact and fiction in the book, I wasn't sure how to use it in a history book. But I also think, while it might be a historian's nightmare to have a book that flirts between fact and fiction in the way it does, it's just brilliantly, brilliantly written. Also around that world, of course, was Allen Ginsberg, the great poet of Howl and friend of the Diggers, who did perform in Dublin's Liberty Hall in 1993. And I've always loved that in interviews leading up to his visit, he noted that what lured him to Dublin wasn't money, but the promise that Theo Dorgan of Poetry Ireland would procure for him a new tweed suit. They got it in Kevin and Howlin on Nassau Street, and apparently Allen Ginsberg was buried in that Nassau Street suit. So fascinating to imagine that one of the architects of that great summer of love may have been sitting, as we all have done, in Neary's, MacDaid's and beyond. I hope you enjoyed that edition of the Three Castles Burning podcast. Nice to be back with you for another year. Thank you as ever for tuning in. Lots more on the way.